thank you guys for coming today. I mostly wanted to give a brief introduction to water quality and sort of try to tie like what's going on here in this particular neighborhood with what's going on in the brook that we're standing near here. So, I mean, I guess historically, just so you guys, sort of have a feel for water and, what the situation is. Historically, people wanted to get water off their land, right? They wanted to ditch it and just like move it away from their house or from their farm fields and get it out of there as quickly as they could. And water, is not a big deal in and of itself, but once you combine it with like sediment or rocks, it can start to carry nutrients and it can cover up aquatic organisms that are living in streams so that they can't survive. And as you guys probably know, those little bugs in the streams, those are sort of the base of the food chain, so that's important for anything that eats them. So if we dump a bunch of sediment into this stream, all of a sudden those animals can't live, and the other things that are feeding on them are not going to survive as well. Here in sort of the Lake Champlain Basin, one of the things that we're really worried about is phosphorus. It's a nutrient that you probably have heard of phosphorus. Like if you are a gardener, you might put some on your garden. Phosphorus, nitrogen, potassium, these are all nutrients that you use in fertilizer. But we have too much phosphorus here, really, and in particular in Lake Champlain. So the EPA, US EPA, and Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation have said, you guys need to clean up Lake Champlain. You have too much phosphorus going into there. So they've essentially mandated that happen in several ways. Some of them are like by law, right? Like, for example, the new one is that any property that has over 3 acres of impervious surface of like pavement and roof has to put in stormwater practices on that property to fix the runoff and the stormwater problems that are coming off that property. But those practices don't necessarily apply to smaller properties like the ones here on a private road, private residences. We don't have regulations that say you have to fix this problem. So one of the things that we as Lewis Creek Association are doing is to try to encourage people to put these types of practices onto their own properties or their own private roads to try to improve water quality, phosphorus, nutrients getting into the streams and into the lakes. So here, in the Patrick Brook area, which is this brook that flows out from Lake Iroquois and Lower Pond down through town. There's some other funky things that go on in town, as you may be aware of, like an old essentially canal that was dug to divert the flow of Patrick Brook. But eventually that reached, both of those, the canal and Patrick Brook proper, reached the La Platte River, which then drains out into Lake Champlain in Shelburne Bay. And so the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation and the US EPA have deemed Patrick Brook to be stressed. So from Lower Pond here all the way down to where it meets the La Platte, stressed, which essentially just means that there are things that are impacting the brook that make it so that it doesn't support aquatic life as well as it should. It doesn't have like sort of this best water quality in the brook. And that's mostly due to sediment and physical alterations. So like the canal, things that we've done to change the channel or change the brook. And really what we want to avoid is that stressed status reaching the next level, which is impaired. Once a waterway becomes impaired, then certain sort of things happen and regulations kick into place that force a community to clean up that waterway. So we're trying to,
Lots of money.
Exactly, lots of money. So we want to keep our waterways clean because we care about them, but also because we hopefully don't want to pay a lot more money to clean it up. So hopefully we can do this sort of in the non-regulatory sense. We can take care of things before they become a major problem. So I just want to, I guess, touch briefly on like sort of our best ways to manage water. Like how can we take care of water so that it does what it maybe would have done historically before we came in and put ditches and roads and all this stuff in the way. There are 3 things that we talk about, 3 S's. So slow water down, spread it out, and sink it into the ground. So those are sort of three things that you can think about as you're thinking about how you might manage water. So we don't want to put it into like a pipe where it's going to be contained and go really fast through that pipe and shoot out the end and cause a bunch of erosion. We want to sort of spread it out, give it space to move, give it space to, sink into the ground if it can. So maybe that means creating like a little basin where it can collect and then settle out and sink down into the ground before it shoots off into the brook. And then, I think here in this particular neighborhood, we can sort of maybe walk up the road and talk about some ways that, we might be able to manage water here. And these may apply to, to your own properties too, like if you guys aren't right here in this direct neighborhood. Things like the road surface that are, might be eroding and causing, washing rocks or sediment right into the brook. Taking care of, our swales along the roadsides, making sure that our culverts that pass into the road are like the right size so that the water doesn't get, compressed as it's going through there and then shoot out the end really fast because it's too small, right? It's like taking your finger over the end of your hose. If you put your thumb over it, it's going to really shoot out the end. So we want to make sure those culverts are the right size. Also, of course, like keeping trees, shrubs next to the stream so that water can, filter, slow down before it washes off into the brook. And then I'll just mention a couple other things, I think, before we sort of get going and walk up the hill a little bit. I wanted to mention one project that's ongoing in this Patrick Brook watershed and the Lake Iroquois watershed. Is a grant that was awarded to the Winooski Natural Resources Conservation District in conjunction with Lewis Creek Association and Lake Iroquois Association up the hill. And essentially the grant is looking at potential projects and ways to improve stormwater runoff and other like natural resources projects in this watershed. And so as part of that grant, they're offering free assessments of your property to folks in this watershed. So there's a website that I'll forward out to you later. You can sign up for your assessment, and someone will come out to your property and sort of walk around and look at options, and then provide you with a document after the fact to sort of make some recommendations about things you could do. And then just briefly before we walk, I'll just mention that there is a lot of money right now to make projects like these happen. We have clean water funding from the state that is available for essentially for groups or towns to apply for. It has to be non-regulatory, so not one of these projects I mentioned that you're mandated to do, but it could be something like, we don't know this guy, but his property, he needs to put in a rain garden in his front yard here to, slow the water down before it reaches the swale. I'm using that as an example. I don't really think he needs a rain garden right there, but the idea being that there is funding available for those types of projects to happen if they are, sort of a priority. And so not to be, alarmed by I'm not just saying, hey, everybody go spend your money and put projects in on your own property, but just something to keep in the back of your mind, I guess.
It's especially important, if you're part of a neighborhood with a road association that, it costs a lot to maintain private roads such as this. And, you're dealing with a lot of people, but it's an opportunity to improve that. A lot of times these developments were put in prior to there being any regulations, so oftentimes, and even in the town roads themselves, the culverts are undersized. And so it's an opportunity to have an engineer come out, evaluate it, see what we can do, whether it's people's private driveway culverts that are going off of the main road or culverts within the main road. Like when you walk up here, this culvert started off as a 4-inch pipe when this development went up in here 45 years ago. This was just a wet meadow, and it was a farm road, and it started, and the water was coming down, but it just spread out over this entire wet meadow or wetland. And by putting in too small of it, it started to create more and more of a channel. And so it's a time, some of these problems we're dealing with are historic problems from 100 years ago, 150 years ago, when the mountains were deforested and all the logging came off, and whenever, when you skid a log or you drag your foot, you're creating an opportunity for water to run there. And so this is a long-term problem. It's going to take a long time. Politicians and all of us like instant gratification, but there's no better time to do it than now. We may not see the results, but we know that we've learned a lot through science, and that we're trying our best to clean it up and do what we know now.
How many houses like this house on up the road, roughly?
Bob,
So there's two roads to look at.
This is kind of bedrock here, and so there's a pretty steep gradient if you know Richmond Road, and when we start walking up here, and what would happen kind of naturally before the road here, so the road essentially created a dam, and it would have come down, and then you see how flat it is in here? It would have come down, and it's what's called an attenuation site. So rivers generally have curves in it. That slows them down. They deposit sand on one side, the bigger stuff, it separates out, and then when it gets down onto a flat site or a floodplain or a wetland, it disperses. So naturally that's what happens on rivers and streams. They slow down and they spread out, and it sinks in, and that recharges our aquifer. So our wells, if we have wells. So that's what would have been happening in here before the road went in. There also is a dam over there that, if you know the cemetery at all, there's a dam up there. It's above where Abby lives.
Yes.
And so this whole area in here, if you look and drive up the cemetery, you'll see that there's a very big flat plateau right here. So all of this water, before it even got to the village, would have been spreading out. And then there's another bedrock control further down, and there's a big drop right where that dam is that powered the mills. So there were 12 mills between where Iroquois Manufacturing is and where Abby lives at one time. They weren't all there at the same time.
So can I just ask, does that mean, is there an advantage in this case?
Well, in this case, the dam,
make it spread out?
it did. The dam was doing that, and then the beavers came in. The dam was built out of stone, and it began to deteriorate due to some vandalism and not being used. But then the beavers came in and built a dam, and it was called the Mill Pond. It was beautiful up at the cemetery. But then people didn't like the beavers, so the beavers got removed. So the beavers are not here doing what could have been done, because if they were, then all of this would be flooded, and people have a little bit of conflict with the beavers.
There's one beaver pond kind of over there, though.
Yeah, but I don't think the beavers are active there right now. Maybe they are.
Yeah.
They'll come back. They'll come and go.
Yeah.
So.
In this while we're standing here so you guys can see it. I mean, if you look way up there, you'll see where the water has come down sort of on the right side of the road here and wash out, underneath Abbey here, and then come down all along the right side of the road. And it obviously goes quite a ways, like almost to the brook there, before it sort of escapes the road surface. So that's the sort of thing that, an engineer or whatever would come out here and say, okay, we gotta create a path we gotta crown the road, we gotta make it move off to the side and maybe settle out in a little basin somewhere where the water can stop, occasionally, like create these little turnouts so it doesn't just do a whatever half-mile shot straight down the road and into the brook.
But then it also requires kind of annual maintenance, because with 13, 12 houses, people going in and out, the UPS truck, you're going to get those tire ruts.
And once a little bit of erosion starts, it just accelerates. So, you know, we all want to not pay a lot to be maintaining our roads, but in the end, a little bit of maintenance annually really prevents major regrading that you have to pay big bucks for, and it's going to improve water quality. So, but it's very hard to get everybody to agree to pay that little bit of money.
Andrea, do you want the story on it's a pretty quick story.
Sure.
On this road, so I moved in 7-8 years ago, and when I came here, I said, oh, we need to crown this road and clean out the ditches and stuff. And basically the story was, well, we tried that, we spent a lot of money on it, and it lasted like 1 year, and then we were right back to it. And basically what they said is that, you know, the snowplow would move the gravel, and it would create little berms on the side, and the water would channel the water into the middle, so the crowning was not working, and they were right back where they were before with big, if we get a really big downpour, we get a 1 foot, we get, you know, a 1 foot ditch going right down the middle of this road. And then, but we have 3 landowners that have tractors. So, pull their box grader, and just like that, it's gone. Not, you know, it's still not crowned, and it's going to happen on the next rain. But anyhow, all that
you're not pulling everything
all
back.
that material is still working its way down here and working its way, you know, ultimately into Patrick Brook. So.
A little bit of a general overview of bats, because people have different levels of knowledge about the different species we have here, and get an understanding of who has that basic information. So anyone know how many species of bats we have here in Vermont? 25. 2.
6.
We have 9 species. You are closest without going over. I think you win on the Price is Right. So we have 9 species of bats here in Vermont. All 9 of those could occur here. And we know that Indiana bats are very concentrated in the Champlain Valley of Vermont. And in fact, this is the northeast edge of their known range, their entire range. Hinesburg is. And a colony that we're aware of, that I was just talking to John, he was part of some of the survey work that happened many years ago. I think it was 2008.
No, 2000,
2007,
probably
8.
2005, 2006.
Yeah, I think it was
Well, the
5 or 6.
captures were 2007 and 8.
Really?
At least our capture records, but they might have done other kind of preliminary
Well, the
work
preliminary
before
surveys,
that.
and because we got the funding
We got
to be
the
able to
money,
close
yeah.
in
Yep.
2007. So I
Excellent.
think it was actually probably 2006 that we did the first mist nets
Okay.
with Scott.
Okay. So
Yeah.
maybe it was
And
the,
found that big tree
Yeah, and we did the radio
right
collars
on
and
Lewis Creek Road that was like a mother tree.
Nice. So we went, you may have heard in the news, even if you didn't know where it was, that we revisited that colony. So I've been doing the bat work for the state for the last 12 years, I guess. And I've been trying to revisit these colonies around the state where we know that Indiana bats are. And so I'd say I'm happy to answer questions about all sorts of other bat species and chat generally about bats and habitat use, but I think that's definitely kind of the focus of what I'm hoping we can talk about here, because that species is a federally endangered species. They've been endangered since the 1960s, one of the first species listed federally. And most of that was due to human persecution, really at the caves and mines where they would hibernate in the winter. They can be really highly concentrated. They roost out in the open. And a lot of those sites had tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of bats, the large sites in the Midwest, mostly where they were in the Southeast. And people were so afraid of rabies and other things about bats that they literally would go in and set fire to some of these sites, trying to kill all the bats or shoot them out of the cave. So a lot of great conservation work has been done over time to change people's perception of bats. And I think in Vermont, there's an undergraduate student, Hannah Comitis, who just finished her thesis on the public perceptions of bats in Chittenden County. and that was just an undergraduate thesis, but it was really a neat survey project that she did, trying to understand how people's perceptions maybe had changed after COVID and whether they thought that was associated with bats. But overall, it was really exciting to see. It was a voluntary survey, so some caveats there, but that people's overall perceptions of bats are maybe where we thought they were in Vermont, which is pretty positive. So that definitely has changed over time in terms of that direct persecution, but habitat loss continues to be a threat to the species, and white nose syndrome is a threat to that species along with many others, but it wasn't the hardest hit. We have 3 that were even harder hit than the Indiana bat. So they suffered moderate to severe declines, and then we have 3 others, the tricolored little brown and northern longed bat, who declined by more than 90%. So that's 9 out of 10 bats just died within a year or 2 when the disease hit Vermont, and then it's just spread out. I think it's 38 states and 7 Canadian provinces now where the disease is known to be, so it's spread across the US and Canada at this point, and had similar effects where it goes. So Indiana bats have been known here in the Champlain Valley, and but we did see that after white nose syndrome, the few hibernation sites that we have in the state declined really significantly, and a few of the sites we hadn't seen Indiana bats at. Luckily, we did in our last survey effort see them at 2 sites that we hadn't seen them at since white nose syndrome hit. So that's been very exciting. And the numbers are still very small, but it's because most of our bats, as far as we understand, go across the lake. They just hop over Lake Champlain and end up in New York State, where there are much larger hibernacula there. There's one old mine over there in New York State, which is only 30 to 50 miles for the bats to fly to get to all of these summer maternity colonies in the Champlain Valley. So to understand what this means in terms of bat biology and their life stages, this time of year in the spring, we're seeing bats start to what we call stage. So they're coming up from the depths of these hibernation sites at mines and caves, and they're hanging out in these entrance halls at the larger sites, and they'll do test flights. Last night I was up at a site, and they're coming out, they're kind of checking the weather conditions, they're warming up after a long winter of many long torpor bouts, and they're grooming off the fungus because they're still getting infected with the fungus, and they're getting ready to try to fatten up if they can, and they have time a little bit. But a lot of them just jet out. As soon as they're ready, they jet out, and they make that 30 to 300 mile typical flight of an Indiana bat and head back to their summer maternity site, which might be in trees that are in your yard. If you're a little brown bat, which is another species that we have in large concentrations underground, they'll be going back to attics and barns and bat houses. And I've been getting a couple questions about barns and bat houses. So bat houses, if you're putting one up, height is important. So trying to get it at least 10 feet off the ground is great. Size is really important. A little bird box is not going to work well for bats. You might get a male or 2 in there, but not usually a maternity colony. So the larger the better. And multiple chambers, because if it gets super hot or cool in there, they want the ability to move around without having to pick up their pups and move to a totally different roost. But we do know that bats are switching roosts. So maybe the Indiana bats were using the tree that you're talking about on your property or on the edge of the road, but they also were switching and moving around. So when you attach them to mist nets and then follow them with radio telemetry, or following them and they're switching roosts every couple days on average for most of these species. So they have a whole network they know
How
of.
long do they live for? I mean, I know
Yeah.
it's going to
Any
vary, but
guesses?
I'm going to say 3 years.
Okay. Any other? Some of you have been
5
out
to
doing
8?
some 5 to 8.
8.
We know the longest record that we know of for little brown bat is 34, and that's over in New York State. Very different than other small mammal species. They're not rodents. They have, most of our species have 1 young per year, and they're investing all their energy into that 1 young. Only 60 or 70% tend to survive through their first year. That's the toughest one. But then a lot of them have a long life after that. And we only know about their age by banding bats and recapturing them at a later date. So they could live even longer than that, but it's those recaptures that gave us the record of the 34-year-old bat. And there have been some others in their 30s as well for that species. So very different again than most small animals or small mammals that we know of. They tend to live a long time. And we think that that hibernation behavior might have something to do with that. Unfortunately, that's also what makes them vulnerable to white nose syndrome, the fungal disease that's killed so many. So we know bats are still living with that, but we're seeing some really encouraging results. For little brown bats, the ones that roost in structures, although 9 out of 10 of them died initially, we have people all around the state who are volunteering to count them as they come out of structures. And we found that their populations are stable, and that's very exciting. So we didn't know if we were going to continue to see declines at any level, and it appears that the post-white nose syndrome over the last decades has been fairly positive for that species. And we're seeing that from some of our neighboring states as well that have had the disease here for a long time. For Indiana bats, who had more of a 65% decline in the Northeast is what we measured initially, they are continuing to decline in many parts of their range. And we're not exactly sure why they were a little less susceptible in the beginning, but seem to be maybe catching up in some ways to the other species. And it's probably due to many factors, not just white nose syndrome, even though that was what caused this precipitous decline. So what we're seeing with that species is I've been going back and trying to revisit the sites. So here we are in spring. I talked about them staging and getting ready to fly off to their summer colonies. When these bats, all these hibernating species, return to their summer colonies, they then are starting that reproductive cycle where their pregnancy starts. And their young usually, so the pregnancy is usually anywhere from 60 to 80 days for our species. So for Indianas and little browns, about 60 days to 2 months. And then they give birth to a single young, and for most of these species. And then the young, within about 4 weeks, is able to fly, but just like other mammals, they're being weaned. So they're still nursing from mom, but then they're going out and learning how to forage. So they're still pretty vulnerable for another several weeks while they kind of get their foraging abilities honed, I think. And then towards the end of the summer, they go back to the hibernation sites where they swarm. The young of the year may not be mating the first fall, but the adult males head back there early on to make sure they have reproductive opportunity, and then the adult females end up coming in after they've fattened up a little bit on their summer range. And that's where it's all this genetic mixing. I like to think of it as speed dating. We'll see if you hang out one of those entrances, you'll catch a lot of males over and over again. They're like waiting for opportunities. And then different females will come in, and they'll go into the cave mostly and mate in there. And then they might actually visit other swarm sites. So that helps again with that genetic mixing. So even though we went through a population bottleneck, we're seeing with little brown bats, from a genetic standpoint, that we appear to have this really rapid evolutionary rescue going on, where that source population may actually be able to rescue the population for that species as a whole. We know less about the other species, but what we're seeing with Indiana bats, population-wise, is that when we're returning to those summer areas, and this is a prime example, the site in Hinesburg in your neighborhood there, that we are going back to those and we're seeing many fewer bats at those sites. So if we count bats coming out of trees before white nose syndrome, we might see 50 to 350 bats coming out of a single tree at those primary maternity roosts. Post white nose syndrome, we rarely saw more than 50 bats exiting a tree. So a really big difference in those colony sizes. And each summer we'll visit 1 or 2 of those sites. We'll put our mist nets out again, capture the bats, use radio telemetry to track them back. And we've even gone back twice post-white nose syndrome to the mine over in New York, put transmitters on those bats and stood across Lake Champlain, or used an airplane before my time to track them coming across and find their maternity sites. And what we're finding is they're going back to the same places. Those colonies, for the most part, still exist in similar locations. It's just that their numbers are smaller. Until I got here. And then I was very surprised to find that when we put up our nets, boom, 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 we had Indiana bats right in our nets, right at dusk, and used our 3 transmitters right away, and had to close our nets because we were too busy getting transmitters on bats. We tracked them around, so not only were they using the same area, all of the roosts that we were able to locate were on conserved land, part of it the land that was conserved with the funds that you're talking about initially, the La Platte River, the La Platte Headwaters Town Forest, and some other easement land behind a neighbor's house down across Lewis Creek Road. And but what was surprising to us were 2 things. One, the colony sizes huge. And this is the very northeast extent of what we know their range to be. So we were counting in each one of the roosts that we discovered between 100 and 300 bats, which was very exciting and a first in all of the decade of post-white nose monitoring. And they were using bat houses. Now this species has been documented using structures in their range, but we had never seen this in Vermont, and we have done a lot of capture and tracking of these bats. Again, from the moment they leave the hibernacula all the way through capturing them in the summer and tracking and saying, just take us to where you live. And not a single time did we find them in a structure. We also collect droppings from landowners, like the bats using your barn. And I can identify them to species myself, but I've independently had those tested many times at labs. And every time it's coming back that we're correctly identifying little brown or big brown bats in structures. You know that northern long-eared bats can use structures too more frequently. But again, little Indiana bats very rare until this colony. And I don't know if it's just opportunity that they decided these bat houses were great, because there's plenty of natural habitat up there. And natural habitat is trees that are larger on average than the trees in the stand. They tend to want to use trees that are 12 inches in diameter or over. 18 inches or more is like the gold mine. You'll find most bats concentrated there, but they'll use anything from 5 inches on up. So that means they might have a main roost that's the largest tree where most of the bats are coming out, but they might then have satellite roosts that they switch among depending on weather conditions, parasite load, disturbance, predator activity, where they are in their reproductive stage and things like that. And they'll move around between the rest of those trees, and they can be as small as 5 inches in diameter. But they have typically peeling bark. So this is a species that, unlike a lot of our species that goes for cracks or cavities like you might see in some snags, these bats are looking for peeling bark, whether it's a really mature tree, and I think we walked by maybe at least one really mature maple down that way that had, just because it was so large, a few pieces of peeling bark. Sometimes when you get the larger trees, they'll just have a little bit of bark that peels away. As long as it's in a roof-like fashion, that can be great for Indianas. Half the time they're using any species that creates that. I've tracked them to white pine, to dead ash and elm that are dead and dying. But also they're using live shagbark hickory. So the other 50% of the roosts that we know about are in live shagbark hickory. And if you look throughout the species range, that's not necessarily true. It's just where shagbark hickory is. And so that might be an influence as to why they're concentrated in the Champlain Valley. They also don't tend to like the higher elevations. They're cooler. So we have a cutoff of about 1,200 feet where we don't tend to find that species. We haven't documented them in our capture efforts above 1,200 feet. So the Green Mountains tends to be a barrier too. So what we know about this species now is they're using the bat houses at this one location. And so we're curious as to why. We wanted to make sure that we weren't, that it wasn't a mixture of little browns and Indiana bats. These species tend to go to their own roosts in the summer and not combine species like they do underground in the winter. But we captured bats coming out of the bat houses, and they were all Indiana bats in their pups. So when we counted all 3 of the bat houses that had Indiana bats and the main roost tree that we had discovered, that was maybe a couple tenths of a mile away. For the colony, because these bats were all switching back and forth, so we knew they were all related in one colony, we counted over 700 bats in one night. So that is a huge colony for post-white nose syndrome. Very exciting. So this brought up a lot of questions. It was, so why are they using bat houses? Why is this colony so large? Why is it at the edge of the range where you tend to find smaller populations traditionally with a lot of wildlife species? And should we be looking further? Should we be going further afield? And that's why I was so excited when Kate reached out to come here, because that's our furthest northeast survey site. So I'd like to get information about whether these bats are using what we would consider suitable habitat further to the north and east, and where the other barriers might be before we hit that elevation barrier. Because climate change models predict that it's possible that this species in particular could have a range shift over the next 30 to 50 years to the northeast, because some of those southeast and Midwest locations will get too hot for them in the summer. So it's an interesting suite of questions. So I've just talked a lot at you. I don't know if you want to walk a little bit to stay warm, and then we'll take questions as people think about them.
They all eat insects, right?
Yes,
So
yes.
do they want to be over wetlands and ponds
Yes.
and stuff like that?
Okay, yes, I'll finish my bat house thought, and then yes, I can talk about that, those other habitat components. So you were talking about the bat houses on a tree. Although bats use trees, we find through a lot of work that colleagues have done and our own experience that they don't tend to occupy bat houses on trees.
We got it up 10 feet off the ground.
Yeah.
And as I was describing, at the head of the driveway corridor,
Yep.
where they like to fly
Direction
Yeah,
and things like that.
exposure.
Yep. So solar exposure is important because, again, those pups are hairless and mom usually leaves them behind because they're a quarter of her body weight when they're born, and then they rapidly grow in the next 4 weeks until they're her size. So aspect is important. South and west are the preferred directions, but if you know you have a big colony of bats, we give people 2 bat houses. You want to put one in that hot sunny location, and you want to put one maybe east facing or even sometimes north facing or even on the other side of the post, so that they have a cooler option. Because when we get a 90-degree week and it's 125 in the bat house, those bats didn't pull out those, I like to picture them like these teeny tiny iPhones that they would like pull out and be like, what's the weather going to be like tomorrow? Oh, we should move the pups. Since they can't do that, they might be stuck somewhere. And if you have a bat house with multiple chambers, it can be 15 degrees different between the top, the attic of the front in the sun, and the bottom of the bat, and there's built-in vents in those types of structures. So they can just move within that. The pups can just climb within that, or to a bat house on the other side of the post. Or if mom needed to, she could make a quick flight to the bat house that you put in a cooler location. So variety, I would say variety is the spice of life there. With Indiana bats, they tend to be selecting roost trees that are on a slope as well, that are facing south through west. Now you can find them in other aspects, but most of the roofs that they're choosing are facing south and west on a bit of an incline. So that tells you a little bit about the species. And then in the fall, they head back to those sites to swarm and mate, and then hibernate over the long winter, come back out in the spring, and the females initiate pregnancy because they actually stored the sperm over the winter. And then when they come out, and likely they're fattening up and their hormones are signaling them to ovulate, they ovulate, and then that fertilizes the egg.
And do the males come also, or do the males hang around in the hibernacula for the winter? Do they migrate?
They migrate as well.
Uh-huh.
Different species we know different information about in terms of whether they stay closer to the hibernacula. We typically see that some of the males might stay around the hibernacula. It depends on the hibernacula. Others will go back to a summer site. If you have 1 or 2 bats roosting at your house, those are probably males, or what we call a bachelor colony. And sometimes you can catch a male in with the females, but for the most part they don't want to have anything to do with the noisy maternity colony. And they're more flexible. They can move around and just go where the food is good, because they don't have to stay where those pups are stationed. We know that the maternity colony range for an Indiana bat in the Champlain Valley is about 2.5 mile radius. So if the roosts are here within about 2.5 miles, that's where they're foraging, getting their fresh water to drink, and commuting between their roosts and their roost and foraging opportunities. And those are absolutely tied to water. So lactating is not only the most expensive time to raise that pup, that again by 4 weeks is about the length of the mom, but it also is the time that they have a great water need. So we tend to find that if you watch bats exit a structure or roost, that you can pretty much guarantee they're heading towards a water source. So if there's a pond somewhere, you'll see them come out and then beeline towards whatever that water source is. And those tend not to be a brook like this, because the bat needs to dip down into a water source.
So like a beaver pond,
A
right?
beaver pond, or a wetland, a pond, a slow-moving river, Otter Creek, parts of the Lewis Creek where it slows
where
down.
it slows down.
Yep, but these are also little browns, and Indiana bats in particular feed on aquatic insects as well. There's a lot of overlap in what our bats eat in terms of species of moths and beetles, just depending on the size of the bat, what they're targeting. But there's a lot of general foraging activity and overlap in many species they're targeting. But there is a little bit of slight specialization where Indiana little brown bats are tied to those aquatic insects as well. So we really see them not only using those water sources for drinking, but also for foraging on those types of insects. Northern long-eared bats and eastern small-footed bats tend to be interior foragers. So then you can look at the landscape and see, well, the mid-story here is pretty open. So it'd be pretty easy for a bat that's foraging on the interior to be getting a lot to eat. But when you get into a really cluttered mid-story and understory here, it's a lot harder for most bats to navigate that as successfully. They're great navigators, but it's going to be a lot faster and more efficient for them to get into a space that they can move around easier. So that's another thing to think about in terms of an element of management and a way that invasive species are affecting bats. Also, a lot of the invasive plant species are not attracting as diverse a variety of insects, so fewer species, because they're not necessarily native to here and probably don't have that variety of species that are adapted to interacting with those plant species. So that's another way in which managing for invasives can actually be a positive for bats and making sure that there's the native vegetation.
Is there any,
Sorry, go ahead.
is there any way, I can't imagine how, but you can determine whether a bat has a band on it while it's moving around, or
Not
when
that
it
I've
stops
done.
for a moment?
If you were to get
catch
close
one,
enough that you could see it if it
Could
stopped.
you
Yeah,
actually
but
see a band on a band?
if they shine silver, I'll see them when bats are roosting in the cage against the Hinesburg. To be able to read the number, you
No,
usually have to be
But just to
pretty
know
close.
whether it's a banded
expanded.
bat
Yep.
or
Yeah,
not.
people sometimes will see them, bats behind the shutters, and I've gotten a good photo that is able to actually read the numbers.
Okay, yep,
Yep.
all right,
Yep.
good, I'll watch.
Excellent. So I would just say try putting that bat house up on a structure or a post instead, and you might have more
You're signaling bat house like
Yeah.
that, and that's
Yep.
the size of what we
Yeah.
have. It's got a little roof on the very top
Yep.
with roofing material.
Okay.
I-
Does it have
I-
multiple chambers inside?
I don't know, can I
Okay.
look inside
Yeah,
somehow?
I would look inside. I would keep it. The bottom should be open,
Yes, the bottom
and then
is.
there should be a landing platform so the bat can come in and land and then
Yeah.
crawl up into the chambers. And the chambers should be 3/4 of an inch to an inch.
And they're vertical chambers.
Yep, exactly.
Oh,
And they
okay.
should be roughened or scored on the inside in some way that the bats can
They
get
can
purchased and
get a
climb up.
hold.
So you can do that with plywood or rough cut lumber is actually fantastic for that.
All right,
Yeah.
good.
I was just going to ask about the migratory habits. So, to me, it's fascinating that in the 13 years we've been in this house, we've always had bats that have lived in our barn. We have no idea how many there are. You kind of blew my mind when you said they can live 30 some odd years, because, to me, I kind of think of them like rodents, just with wings. So that is amazing. So I'm curious, I don't know if it's the same bat or bats that have been living there. I don't know how many bats have been living there. When it comes to their migration patterns, obviously I feel like they come back to the same place. They leave every winter, and every summer the guano appears. So, is it the kind of thing where I almost compare it to like spawning salmon, like they know to return, their family members know to return, so once they've established this place as a colony, then generations and generations of bats will keep on coming back?
That's exactly how it works. All these species have high site fidelity, we call it. So they do return to the same locations, the same hibernacula year after year in many cases. So you'll find, we know that because we catch those banded individuals at the same locations and then at the same summer sites. So it's difficult because with radio telemetry, the equipment it only lasts 2 weeks. The batteries are very tiny, don't last very long, and it falls off by the bat about that time anyway. So you can't monitor an individual long term in that way. But if you can recapture them, and so we have that information as a bat community for a lot of these species, that they're going back to the same trees, the same barns, the same bat houses. Their daughters are coming back, their daughters' daughters are coming back. So you'll see multiple generations
And
like
if
that.
it's a male colony, would it?
They tend to come back too. So yeah, we've had stopover location where you'll have spring and fall activity, but no summer activity. But for what you're talking about, you definitely have a maternity colony. So that is female bats, and they're raising their pups, and there can be many generations of those females. There might be another corner of the barn where some males live away from all the commotion.
I mean, the barn's big and it's old and it needs a lot of work. So there's a zillion different openings. We were told years ago when we contacted Fish and Wildlife that, you know, a bat can enter, if it's a quarter of an inch, they can space, they can get in. So there's all sorts of entry points. There's no way we could ever block off all the entry points.
Yeah, that's true. If there's certain areas that you would be more okay with them living, people with barns have installed 3/4 inch slats to encourage the bats to go over there, and that has often been successful. And if you want to discourage them from a certain area, you can either make air movement, and I would say and or, because better to be and, make a party-like atmosphere. So you can hang from the rafters, things like streamers or balloons, and then especially if you point some fan air at that, even if you're just doing that in the early spring before they return, the bats will come in to roost, and it's like, it's too hard to get in there, and they don't want the cool air movement. They're looking for that warm, kind of hot attic barn-like space. And so if there's a certain area you want to sit and hang out in the barn, or you have equipment that you're trying to protect, you can create that airflow. Get a drink. I don't know what kind of insect activity may or may not be attracted by this or not, but edge habitat is really important for a lot of these species. So if you have a big open field, a lot of our species will really be working the edge because they're protected from their main predators. Anyone know who their main predator is?
Owls.
Owls. Yeah. Yep. Or maybe a hawk if they're out a little bit later towards that sunset to dusk period. The species that defy this are our largest species, the hoary bat. They migrate south for the winter and don't hibernate like silver-haired bats or eastern red bats, but they're a much larger species. They're about 3 times the body size of a little brown bat, and so if you see a bat working out in an open field or a really big water body, that could be a hoary bat because they don't seem to be afraid of that predator.
What's their ring?
The wingspan is not incredibly different, but the weight of the bat. So this is like a little brown bat, body size, 3 pennies in your hand, about 8 grams for a fat, healthy bat. A hoary bat would be 30 grams. Big brown bat, about 18 grams.
So I may have missed this, but what
Almost all of our species are really small.
what predates on bats?
Owls. Yep, is the main predator we know of. And then there's a lot of opportunistic foraging on bats. If they're sick bats, we see like ermine droppings in the cave. But even in the cave last night that I was in, we found a couple big fat owls. An owl hood just like hanging out at spring emergence for the kind of weak bats to come out, I think, and it was just chock-a-block full of bat bones. Yeah. So, but even snakes and other ground predators will grab a bat that's fallen to the ground and kind of wait in those really concentrated situations, or sometimes snatch bats out of a roost. Which might be another reason to move on. In Vermont, the hoary bat anywhere would be a flying fox, 6-foot wingspan. I don't know, but my kids have been trying their hardest to invent a way that they can fly. They're convinced they're going to be able to do it, and I don't want to crush their dreams. So they're trying to just, like, how about if our wings were this big? And I was like, well, based on your body size, you need these giant wings. So I used that flying fox. You'll see when you see their wingspan, and then that their body is pretty short compared to that wingspan. But I don't know exactly what the size of their body is. But yeah, you need a lot of wings for that. Yep. Yep. Other questions about habitat use or population?
I have a question about migration. I was just curious, like, so the newborns, are they following their mother back to the hibernaculum and then back in the spring, or do they have some sort of sense of?
Wish we knew.
Okay.
I feel like they have to be learning learning it from somewhere, from someone. Because these spaces, the large site I was at last night is the largest down in southwestern Vermont, where the majority of the bats in all of New England for little brown bats go to hibernate for the winter. But most of our other sites, I mean, you're walking along in the woods and you're like, oh, there it is, and it's a hole this big in the ground, and then we squeeze down through there, and it pops out into some little rooms and openings, and there's maybe 5 to 100 bats in there. But a lot of those sites are pretty small. So how would a bat find that little hole in the ground? They must learn from each other. Yeah. And what we're wondering is we have some sites. We have about 30 hibernacula in Vermont that we know of in caves and mines. And some of those sites have totally zeroed out after the disease. There's no bats left there anymore. And will bats be able to rediscover that? Like, what if nobody exists to tell them where that is? I don't know.
Some explorers out there, maybe.
Yes, well, we do know that in the summer, bats are checking stuff out all the time. So the most nuisance complaints we get are in July and early August, and that's when the young start to fly. I call them juvenile delinquents, because then everyone's got a bat in their house all of a sudden. And invariably, if it happens to be a situation where we get our hands on that bat, you can actually put their wings up to, like, don't do this yourself, don't hand it down. You can shine a light through their wing, and when you look at their finger bones, you can see a hollow space. So that's their wings are all, if you're a bat, you can spread your wings out like this. So go ahead and do this, make space, don't hit your neighbor. Put your thumbs up.
COVID distance.
Your fingers down, and then imagine that your fingers can touch the ground from here. That's the proportion of the length of a bat's fingers to the length of their body. And then their skin stretched between those, and then stretched from there to your legs, and then from your legs to your tail. So you have a tail membrane and a wing membrane on either side. And you have all this flexibility because of those finger bones. So unlike a bird that has stiff feathers, a lot of our bats are really incredibly maneuverable. That's why you have some that specialize in foraging on the interior like that. A lot of them don't take off from the ground really well, because when a bat folds their wings in, their thumbs are up, and that's why you see them when they land on the perch to go up in the bat house, they're actually climbing with their thumbs. Their knees are bent in the other direction, so when they're down on the ground, they're on their wrists and their feet, which are facing the other way, and their knees bent up, and they're pretty much belly down. So it's hard for them to get off the ground, a lot of them. They can, but it's difficult. So that's another reason for being up high in a roost, is that then they can drop down into flight and get
You can just jump out
there.
the door.
Exactly. And
Do
you'll
they
see that.
actually
They'll
have tails?
Yes, they do.
They have the
Yep.
tail wing, and then
And
they
the
also
tail
have a
membrane.
tail membrane.
And that is a great place to catch bugs. So I used to think they were just grabbing them out of the air in their mouth, but what a tiny target, right? To get with your mouth, they're using echolocation to hone in on bugs. They can tell the difference between the back of a beetle and the bark on a tree. And some of our species are picking insects off of trees or gleaning. But when they're hawking them out of the air, you'll actually see they'll hone in on an insect and then
Yeah.
like a net. And then
Their entire, all the membrane
Yeah.
is a net, flying
they're taking
net.
that. Yep. So sometimes they're getting enough, but a lot of times they're using that whole membrane as a net. But it's that thin membrane, which is pretty hairless skin, only a few skin cells thick. That's where white nose syndrome sets in, and the fungus grows and causes big holes when
In the
they try
wing.
to in the wings. Yep.
And do these bats also have pink lips? I heard that's one way of identifying them.
Indiana bats have more pink noses.
Pink
not
noses,
a darker black
not
nose.
lips.
Yep.
Noses,
Yep. Yeah, they're. I guess they're.
I also heard that their scientific name is actually not Indiana but social. It's Socius or
Sodalis.
Sodalis,
Sodalis. I
which
didn't know
means
that meant
social. And so that's my kind of myth
Okay.
of
Okay.
why we have a nice colony down there,
Yeah.
is that it was such a social project and so many people and communities
collaborative.
were involved.
See what happens with that population over time, and it's a completely unique opportunity because a lot of the trees, like the one you were describing, John, the the tree broke off, right?
Yeah,
So
I think
the
that
dead trees they use, we go and revisit some of those, and we'll find that some of them are still being used, but then there are others that have fallen over or all the bark has disappeared, so they're not suitable anymore for bats to roost in, and so they're always looking for replacements. The bat houses, which the Lewis Creek, the La Platte Headwaters folks are going to maintain, those actually the structures tend to be so stable that I feel like we probably could show up almost any night in the peak of the maternity season and probably count bats coming out, whereas a tree might have a couple nights where there's no bats in it, and I don't know if I send somebody out there if they're going to be bats or not. But bat houses are great, and you can kind of set up your lawn chair and watch, and the sunset is beautiful there. So if you're
The bugs are pretty intense too.
Yeah. I don't know. I just
we were to find a bat and we wanted to have some help identifying it. What would be the best way to go about photographing said bat so that you could identify it for us, or a naturalist?
Yeah. So if you can safely take pictures of a bat, full body would be good, but anything you get of the face. And usually it's easier to get those photos if you found a dead bat or something like that. If you can contain the bat, I tend to like to put a Tupperware container or something clear like that over them, and then scoop a piece of stiff cardboard or paperboard under them, like a large cereal box, to move them, because with the clear container I can see that I've gotten the bat, that I'm not crushing the springs. I don't like to throw a cloth over because it's like, I don't know where the bat is, and they could bite you through the cloth, so I recommend a clear container. If they're flying around inside, they eventually tend to land on something to rest. They have trouble sometimes finding those because they're in a panic, just like you are when they get into the house and you see them. But when they stop, you can walk right up to them with that container. They don't tend to scurry off like something else because I think they don't have a lot of natural predators willing to snatch them. So that's the safest way. You can put gloves on additionally just to make sure you're protected. Multiple species could use something like this. Multiple species of bats, but multiple species of wildlife. So like porcupine will go into cavity trees, squirrels, flying squirrels, all sorts of animals will use these cavities. So that's a very valuable tree. And the larger the diameter, usually the more likely it's to be selected by a lot of these species. The northern long-eared bats, the silver-haired and big brown bats will use cavity trees as well.
So this one has pretty good west exposure. Is that a good thing, or?
It can be. I would say just overall having some openings up high where there's not trees blocking it in general is another good.
Yeah, so there's a couple more up here that are more interior.
Okay.
Take a look.
Yep.
Would you find multiple different species of bat in the same tree at the same time?
I never have, but I think the disadvantage is often we have a radio transmitter on one bat, we track her bat, and we count all the bats coming out, assuming they're the same. There has been some work in other states where, and we have here too, where we netted a tree, and usually we find it's all the same species, which the bat houses were too. So that's generally what we find. The rare mixing of species usually has been in a large structure like a barn or something like that, where little browns and northern long-eared bats typically have been found together, and sometimes little browns and big browns, but usually on different sides of the structure, not together. Okay. It sometimes can open up spaces in the canopy, so that's another way in which you create great potential for Indiana bats in particular, who like a sunnier kind of roost. Northern long-eared bats tend to use roosts that are really more suppressed in the canopy and in darker places. And why for bats that's like the same exact size, they choose such different roosts, I don't know. But they do. Could be just competition, so different adaptations to that.
We had a question about if you can see guano underneath like
Oh.
a tree or roost or...
I haven't before. You should be able to, because you certainly see it under the bat houses. So I don't know if I don't know if a lot of it just is getting caught somewhere before it makes it down into a pile on the barn, like inside the cavity, or I have when I did track out an Indiana bat to a really large roost, I did started right in the middle of the summer. It didn't seem to last, but a few of the leaves of the vegetation underneath, there were, like, I found 2 pieces of guano, but I didn't find a pile. Yeah, didn't find that pile like you find in a building. Yeah. We have a dog, my colleague, Amy, who manages Dead Creek. We're working on training her dog on detection work for sniffing out guano. So we're hoping to maybe be able to find some trees that way. Yeah, we'll see. We haven't figured out like how their vertical sniffing would work in that case, right? So if you're not getting it on the ground, like how close would the dog have to be to detect that bats are roosting 20 feet up and the guano was caught somewhere? I don't know. We'll have to figure it out. Yeah. Thanks.